Hello friends, welcome back to this series of designing your own Lancelot speaker. So this is part 2 and it's actually part 2A because I have to split this into 15-minute chunks, so not to run to a half hour because it will be a little bit longer. There's much to deal with, but welcome or welcome back. So in this part we're going to look at and pick up from where we left, is because we now have our drivers and then we're going to design our case. So I look at the volume of the case and also sort of go into the concepts of things like the dimensions that we're going to use, because Alan has a question here about Janos recommending unique box dimensions to reflect a particular musical three-tone chord. So we'll go into that. It has to do with resonances. We'll look at the active cabinet and considerations of the design there, and he also asks about the horn approach that I took. But first of all, we've got our drivers. Now Scott commented on our video. This is one thing to maybe look at. Scott commented on my first video for the search of drivers that there is a service called Hi-Fi Shark, and that seems to aggregate and search on all kinds of sites for hi-fi equipment or hi-fi components. So that might be of interest to you in finding stuff, because you also can filter out for your country and it will aggregate the search. So that might be very handy. I haven't used it myself, but I thought it might be good for to share. So once we got our drivers, we can actually measure them with something like this. This is quite cheap, Dayton Audio's DATS-3. We can use a microphone to measure the frequency response, and so then we're knowing what we're dealing with. So with this we also have all the TS, the TL small parameters, and once we have those, we can use any little program to determine the bass reflex port and the bass reflex cabinet, the volume that we want to get the right response. Now I won't go doing any hand holding and so on in doing that. Janos has also enough videos on that. So once you do that, you'll actually come up for your driver with a certain internal cabinet space that you want. So once you know that goal, you still want to design a slightly bigger cabinet, because everything that is inside the cabinet and also the construction that we'll be using, like the frame and the divider, to create the mesh-loaded transmission line, all of those things will take space and will take away from the internal volume. And so we need to allow for that. And so you can just do those calculations, how much that will be. And then you can and for example, what I did, I wanted 170 liters to go with that. And I had about 13 or 14 liters that I had to add up to account for the losses that I'll be suffering to stuff hanging inside the box. For example, also this is quite voluminous. It's a couple of liters that just gets lost because the compression driver is inside. If you have it on the outside, no problem. You don't need to add as much. So once you got those dimensions, the volume that you want to reach, then you can look at the dimensions. Now, I'll use Alan's questions to actually go through that and to sort of guide us through that process. So let's start here. I'd be interested in more information about your horn approach. That seems to be a departure from Janos. And what Alan is referring to here is that I'm using a tapered horn, while Janos is using a straight transmission line, a mesh-loaded transmission line. So his second question is, somebody else asked this as well. How do you know which frequencies are being activated? I noticed in the building of in his little petit video that Janos recommended unique box dimensions to reflect a particular musical three-tone chord. Did you do that within the volume dictates of the software? Yes, I did. So I did indeed had the volume dictate, if you want. So what I wanted to accomplish, and then I sized up the internal parameters. And I'll get into that scales because that's the spreadsheet that you're seeing. Now, I'm assuming that any particular dimension of the cabinet will resonate at a quarter wavelength of that particular dimension. Yes, Alan, that's completely correct. But then you go on to say, like, but each panel has 2 dimensions. Does it resonate at the long or the short frequency or both? Now, it is really the first part that you suggested. So it is, if you look at say the front and the back wall, for instance, that dimension, it doesn't matter which one we pick, top and bottom, doesn't matter really, left to right, but it's usually top to bottom and back to front. And that's just because the drivers sit in the front. So what you get is the distance between the front and the back wall. And what happens is, what we have to look at, so in a half wavelength, of course, the signal goes from going to positive, goes back to negative. So that's a half wavelength, and then it goes negative, comes back to positive, right? So if the wall would, the front wall is here, and this is the back wall, so if the woofer or the front panel would move backwards, it sends a shock wave, a high compression air, and it will travel through the air, bounce back off the side, and come here. So what can happen in the worst circumstance when you get ringing is when it takes a half wavelength, so once this moves back and goes back, if then the shock wave comes back from the back wall and arrives at the same time as the front moves the other way, that's when you get that superb, that is when you have the most support that comes back from that reflected wave. It also happens at double the frequency, but that's much less. So the half, we need a half wavelength for that distance in total, back and forwards, to support this, because then we are just on the phase reversal. So the whole thing that is the most resonant is the quarter wavelength. And for example, if we have a look at, this is John Atkinson measuring an audio note speaker. You can see audio note speakers are also undamped. You see large resonance peaks. And the higher frequency is from the shorter distance. So this is probably the front to back wall. And then here you've got, well, if you really look close, you see 2, but this main ridge is the top to bottom. I calculated it once, and I think it corresponded to something like 70 centimeters or so, which is about what the cabinet probably is inside the audio note speaker. And then the little ridge next to it is a bit speculation, but it's probably, I think John Atkinson speculated that was the bass reflex board, which sits at the bottom and the top of the case. So that was resonating. Now, when Janos speaks about putting this on the musical scale, is to make sure that these resonances, when they occur, we still don't want them. Just let's make that clear to start with. We don't want them, but we want those on the musical scale so that they don't sound odd. And here we have this. So I made a small spreadsheet with the musical notes on it and the corresponding frequency, and then the quarter wavelength on which that will correspond to. So once you have, so if I step back to the volume that we had determined that we wanted, we can pick the dimensions, 3 dimensions for height, width and depth, and put our enclosure together with those sizes, and we'll have 3 tones that make up the dimensions, internal dimensions of our box. And by the way, if you're up, the panel size, the height and the width will make a difference in how it a little bit sounds and how much it can vibrate, resonate. But the main thing is just the standing wave that you can cause with it, and that's just the distance between the panels, the opposing panels. Now, for example, what I had in my first speaker is I had a resonance here, this resonance. And luckily it was only an A sharp, but it did get activated. And to be honest, it was also audible, and I didn't like it at all. So, you know, the case for dampening was made. But now I'll go into your questions by doing a step back and going into why we have an active cabinet and how these resonances sit in the case and what we can do about it, what we really want to see happening in the case. So I'll just move it over to my speaker, which I opened up for this occasion. So here's my voice of Lancelot, my second prototype. And as I said, in my first prototype, I had a resonance between the front panel and the back panel. So it was 37 centimeters. It had a 233 hertz thing, and it was clearly, if you measured it, the frequency response of the speaker, you could clearly see that on a waterfall graph. However, strangely enough, it didn't do it in this room, but in another room where I had it set up first, because I was putting it together there, and not in the living room. So it also had to do with sort of being supportive of the case with the room. It was probably that the room was a multiple of the distance that was here in the case. So one thing I thought to do is add some dampening on the back wall to prevent that in my first prototype. And so I noticed two things. So one is it actually didn't, when I put some quite thick 1.5 inch, 5 centimeters, 4-5 centimeters thick insulation on the back wall, just behind the speaker on the other side, the resonance was somewhat lower, but it was still there. And I think the ringing didn't, it was a bit lower, but it was just, it rung just as long. So I think what happened is because I didn't dampen the rest of the cabinet, it was still causing the front and the back to resonate. And, you know, from that I sort of understood, yeah, damping, you know, I can see the case for damping. Let's dampen this a bit. But the other thing, the second thing I noticed was the sound. And the sound had changed, and quite dramatically. It didn't sound good. Where first when I just listened, including the ringing, which was audible and notable, not nice, but the dampening was worse. And it just sucked the life out of the music. Yeah, my learning from that is from that point on, I could sort of, even from YouTube videos, I now can hear the sound signature of dampening. It is not a free lunch, I can tell you. It just isn't. It has a specific sound. And so I think with the industry trend to being highly dampened cases where nothing resonates, nothing vibrates, a lot happens with dampening. And I think, you know, because you have to think about it in this way, that we have this woofer here and it's moving the air. It's going buzzing back and forward. So we got 50% going for you to have music in your room. And then often you've got a shitty little box on this other side that sort of needs to take the other 50% somehow and deal with it. Now, from that you'll probably already understand that the larger case will do much better and will have less side effects sort of burbling back to you than with a small box where that energy is contained and will probably stream back out your woofer at some point. Whether that's so. If you want to prevent that, like most try to do, is take very thick side walls and back walls and bracing so that nothing can vibrate and nothing can resonate. And then on top of that, we need to stuff the whole box with dampening. As I said, it has a signature. You can hear dampening. It has a sound. Very specific sound. Then what happens to all that energy, 50% of that energy that needs to be resolved there? It's not going to go into the sidewalls vibrating or losing in mechanical friction in the material. No, it won't do that. It's not going there. So we got a huge amount of energy. Now, some of that will convert into heat and will get absorbed. But other ones, I think what happens is that, and I think you hear the same if you stick your hole in a tomb or a hole in the ground or so. You dig a hole in the ground and you stick your head in it, the sound changes immediately. It has a very dampened, muffled sound. But it's still, things get still in and get out transformed, and also because of the dampening it will have a delay. So what happens in normal speakers is that some kind of sound will go back to the only hole where the energy can escape, which is your woofer. It will fall out of there again, delayed, smeared, muffled, whatever it is, but you'll get some kind of sound back. And I think people that's changed to open baffle, and I think that's an anti-reaction to over dampening actually, if I sort of look at it as a mass behavior. Open baffle is just the escape from these overdamped things, because then you get rid of the box sound and you get rid of the dampening sound. So I'm not surprised that people are sort of really, relieved to go to open baffle, and and then need to solve the problem with bass response and so on, and that's an art by itself to get that back. to have enough moving surface and support so you can get a normal response and it goes deep enough. So that's damping. Wasn't a good idea. So what I thought is, to answer your question, Alan, about why I diverted from Janos's design, was because I did want an active cabinet, but I didn't want to have those resonances in there. And so part of the solution is that divider. I'll come back to that a little bit later, not very shortly. Now, the thing to understand with an active cabinet, before I get back to the stopping of these resonances, is that what we're trying to do here is the same as an instrument. So the instrument, say a guitar or a violin, has the strings, it has a bridge, and that connects it up to the body, which has a volume of air in it, and then a body on the other side. And you have that can amplifies the movement of the strings. So whenever the strings are moving, that will be moving. And then the instrument maker puts little braces and things in there so that after the player stops playing, there's a little bit of decay, but then it stops. And so if we then look at the analogy of the speaker, it's the same thing. We've got the strings that's being played, it's your woofer. We've got the air now as bridge, and then we've got the side panels. The side panels as the body that is going to make the coupling to the air just like the instrument have. So we get a little bit more efficiency, but we also get that volume, the body of an instrument that it is now able to replicate in this whole big thing is going to very gently use the movement that we have here and replicate it there just based on the air pressure. So it's highly similar. So this is not about resonant behavior using massive musical scales. We actually don't want it, but if it occurs, it'll be at least as nice as possible. But the real goal is to have this move like an instrument, and this will give you the same experience as you would, and because there is a huge discrepancy between a recording of a guitar and hearing a guitar live, and mostly it is because microphones tend to pick up the strings and not the volume. That effect is sort of lost because it's also the strings have a more direct way of sound coming towards the microphone, while that the body of the guitar will go is far more omnidirectional. So I think while you experience all the omnidirectional, the whole energy of it, the microphone only experiences the direct sound. And what you do with a speaker setup like this is that you restore some of that sound, not by adding alien tones all to it, but you're just using a lot of the reproducing technology of instruments to put that back into the signal, because it's just under highlighted in recordings. So what we want is this movement in there, and when this stops, that stops, not ringing. So I hope that cleared it up. I see that a little rain has joined me. Yeah. So if we then go back to your questions, and this is really this answer, this first part of the video is just about this. So if we go back to your answers, so the horn approach, if we look at that, if we now have all the background for us with us to know about standing waves and still wanting to achieve an active cabinet, you can see that in my design, so by the way, all the measurements that you see here are in centimeters. And this is what I measured out for the speaker. All the dimensions are on those musical scales, but you see there's hardly any parallel walls. The divider is a constantly different thing. Even the panel, the side panels that could maybe are parallel still, they are being held in place by this divider, which is glued to the sides on every part, and also varies in length. So there is not a single frequency that is really supported in this enclosure to have standing waves bouncing around. The only way that it's going to bounce around is really in this tunnel that is being guided by the angled, the slanted top, and then a sort of a waveguide to make this transition much more smoother. smoother and just bounce this nicely around through the case. So the pressure waves will stand in here, but there's nothing really parallel that is going to resonate. Now, I'll get into part 2. I'll get a little bit into the woofer positioning as well, which is not in Alan's questions, but I'll deal with it as well. And it has a lot to do with the standing waves as we just start from back to front and so on. So that's my design that I chose. That's why I deviated from the design that Janos had. And I noticed the improvement from prototype 1 to prototype 2. So I think it is a valid approach, even though it's quite subtle, but it certainly solved my back to front frequency problem without adding any dampening. So I'm happy with that. So yeah, I think we did sort of the 3-tone chord, we went with that. So yes, it is important, but also hopefully it is not important. So that concludes the first section. Rest me to answer one of your other questions just as a last bit. So Alan actually asked, what is this? It sounds like Australian, some European language, your accent. So Dutch, that's correct. And where do I live? Well, I live sort of in between Sydney and Brisbane. So this is a map of Australia. We live around 30 latitude, but it doesn't look like Egypt or sandy deserts. So we have those there, but not at the coast. And we live on something called the Dorico Plateau. So we're living in the highlands here. Not too far from the coast, but still at height. So that's that question. So in the second part of this question this video, I'll go into more of the other specifics. I'll have a look at the base port as well, and other questions like that design and what we're doing, and why I don't have this in my speaker, and why Janos does have it. So we'll go into that in a second. Thank you for watching this far. I'll hope to see you in part B. And yeah, rest me to wish you a beautiful day. Hope to see you in the second part of this video. I had to split it up because it's already 20 minutes. Yeah, we're already too far in. So we'll have a last bit part to this, the specifics of the design. But I think you've now got the basics of it. So we have the volume, we have the dimensions, we have the layout. We know what we do with resonances, standing waves. And we'll get to the woofer positioning and where we want this in the case in the next video. Thank you for watching. Have a brilliant day. Bye bye.